Chapter 10. Time Passes. A little white van chugged its way carefully through the valley, the driver humming to himself as the autumn sunshine flickered through the yellow and orange leaves of the roadside trees, making kaleidoscope patterns on his face. Beside him on the passenger seat was a small cage. Inside was a young hedgehog, which had found it hard to live in the wild and was in need of some tender loving care before winter began to bite. He'd never seen a hedgehog with a peculiar single white spike on its back before.
"We'll soon have you somewhere safe, little buddy,"
said the driver softly.
"Don't you worry about nothing, d'ye hear?"
The driver, a dark-haired man with a few flecks of grey, swallowed hard as he passed the spot where he'd so nearly been killed on that fateful day too many years ago. He didn't like to talk about it too much, but some kind of avalanche had come down from Nabtop Mountain and crushed his wagon. Even now he wasn't sure how he'd survived. Just as the snow had hit, he'd flung open his cab door and thrown himself out onto the road. He'd rolled down a hill and into some bushes. It was days before they found him, and when he woke up fixed to wires in a hospital bed, they told him he'd been unconscious for nigh on 4 weeks. They'd given up on him more than once, said the nurses, so he'd better thank his lucky stars. As he slowly recovered, the world began to seem a different place to Jefferson Crape. By the time he was finally allowed to leave hospital with the help of crutches, he felt very different too. A blackbird hopped in front of him on the path out of the hospital grounds, and he found himself standing still so that it wouldn't be frightened. When it flew off, he watched it go, marvelling at its beauty and sharing its sense of joy at being alive and free. A short while afterwards, when his legs had healed and the crutches weren't needed anymore, he'd started working as a volunteer at the Pearlbury Animal Rescue Centre. He'd never enjoyed anything so much, helping to treat injured animals, cleaning out the pens and cages, dishing up the food and driving round the valley to pick up all kinds of critters that had been reported to be hurt or trapped. A woman out walking her dog had come across the little hedgehog now riding along with him in his van. When she phoned in, the woman swore she'd seen an eagle swoop down and leave the animal on the track in front of her, then circle overhead until she'd picked it up and wrapped it in a handkerchief. Jeffersons smiled at the thought. He'd never heard anything so far-fetched in all his cotton-picking life. What he did know was that the little hedgehog with the white spike was so sick and exhausted the poor little mite wouldn't have lasted another hour out in the meadow on his own. "Here you go, little fella," said Jefferson as he pulled up outside the rescue centre, cradled the cage in both hands and walked inside to deliver the animal to a waiting vet. Oh, how contented old Snowdrop Hawthorne would have been to know that his legacy lived on, and that another member of the family, another descendant in the great line of Hawthorns, was being well cared for in its hour of need. Many summers had passed since he'd left the earth to go to a new world up in the clouds, but he hadn't been forgotten. Certainly not. Across Merlin's meadow they still talked of the legend of the pure white Spikeshuffler. At night time all kinds of animals told their offspring epic stories of his bravery and how he'd lived to be the oldest, wisest and fastest Spikeshuffler ever known. They told how, from the moment his eyes had blinked open next to his dear mother and father in the old hedgerow, Snowdrop Hawthorne had been different. Right from the beginning, he'd been special. The end.